talking to these mics, or are
I
they?
don't think we do, but they might help us to record better on our camera. So as long as everybody can hear us all right, I think we probably can. So Monica and Nick, I want to provoke conversation about art and lofty things and big ideas. And so I thought I'd begin by saying that the two of you rode up together on the Metro North to White Plains, and I'm pretty sure everybody in the room would love to know what you guys talked about on the train.
I think we talked about.
I looked at your new book.
You look at mine. I talked about your book.
Yeah.
Yeah. We started with that. I offered you half my bagel.
I declined.
You lost your keys.
Maybe.
You lost your keys. That took up some time.
Right.
So
We talked about schools.
We talked about, we both have kids, and we live in Brooklyn, like our backs of our buildings face each other. This is, yards in between, and but literally, like, you're like sort of, but I really don't know which building yours is. Yeah.
I like to keep it that way.
Yeah. But we're right across from each other. So we talked about, so it's the same public school, but we both have kids. Mine just is finishing elementary schools. That's really all we talk about was schools. That's the usual parent conversation in Brooklyn is like schools. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Brooklynites talk about kids, and New Yorkers talk about real estate. So those are the basic. Okay, so
Staten
you guys,
Island talks about pizza.
apparently, or maybe the most recent murder that happened out there. That was exciting news. All right, so you did talk a little poetry, though. You showed each other some new books. You both got books coming out this year. So let's get more into the serious stuff. Something that I'd like to focus on in the 15 minutes that we have together is the fact that you're both crossover writers, that you're poets and you have a memoir and a novel. And I think that for a lot of students in our program and in this room, choosing between genres is sometimes it's just obvious. It's like, nope, I do this. And sometimes it's not that obvious. So I wondered if you could address that a little bit, and I wanted to maybe ask Nick first, because I believe that you've really always thought of yourself as a poet, but then the memoir hit. And I wonder, which way do you really feel or think about yourself in your writing? How did that kind of shift happen?
Yeah, I mean, the first things I published, and I sort of worked on poetry primarily for, my first book took 10 years to come out. And in the middle of that, I began a book which became the first memoir. About 7 years into that project. Nothing had been published, but I had sort of a few books that I was working on. So then when the first book got published, it looked like I was very prolific, but actually I'd just been working on it for like 15 years. So they sort of just came out, but it looked like I was writing a book a year, but that wasn't true at all. And the prose, just the material I was working on, it lined up with, it was the same material. Some of it was the same material. It was dealing with my childhood and my mother and father, and I dealt with that in the first book of poems, and which is sort of more about my mother probably, and then the memoir is more about my father, and yet and I wouldn't say that's why it's prose and the poetry is more feminine or anything, but his story, the way I presented it was just a longer piece. It just sort of had longer, and it needed more grounding than poetry or something to tell the story. But I feel like I sort of felt the whole time I was writing it, I felt like I was writing poetry still. I didn't write it in a different way than I write poetry. It just, in the end of the day, it just ended up sort of like looking more like prose. But I think there's a lot of poetry in it, though. So.
Do you think that there was sort of a narrative arc in your father's story that presented itself to you as like this is prose because of beginning, middle, end?
Well, one thing is, the story of my father is that he, when I worked in the homeless shelter, he appeared. I didn't grow up with him, and he appeared after I'd been at the homeless shelter for 3 years, homeless at the door, and that's how I got to know him as when he was homeless. And he was homeless for about 5 years, and then he got off the streets. And I'd written about him in the first book of poems, and it was unsettling for some reason for me because it was very easy and understandable for people that heard the poems or read the poems to assume that I just made up this character of a homeless father. And there was something very uncomfortable about that for me, that I would sort of, it happens, fiction writers, if you're a fiction writer or something, you could take on that project, but I think it'd be a big responsibility to do that, to take on the suffering of someone else that's not sort of, that you don't understand really deeply within yourself in some way. I think a fiction writer has to go into it deeply also, if they're going to sort of try to get into some other type of suffering they're really not familiar with. But I hadn't done that, and it really was, this was the story. And so writing the memoir was partially a way so that it would be harder for people to assume that I just created this thing. To write a memoir, so it says nonfiction on it, so there's something about that seemed important to me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Let me pivot to Monica and say, frame the similar question in a different way to you. That what I noticed is that your first collection of poetry and your novel came out in the same year, so that's confusing. Like that brings images of like pivoting between typewriter and, well, I'm not a poet, so I'm going to say quill pen. Totally wrong. I know, totally wrong. I'm a nonfiction person, and the quill pen is what comes to mind with the poetry. I don't know, inkwell. So the pivoting and the writing two things at the same time, maybe like one in each hand or something, which can't possibly be true. So maybe you can demystify that for us. How did that happen?
Well, it happened at different times and during different periods. I started working on that novel project when I started grad school, actually. And so I would work on poems one day, the novel the next day, poems one day, the novel the next day. And then there would be periods where I would just do poetry in the fall and fiction in the spring. And then when I sold the novel and was working with an editor, there were like years I was just working on the fiction. So it really depended on like that particular period. It was just complete, very much like you were saying. It looked like, how did you publish two books at the same time? But I'd been working on them for so long, both of them. And the book of poems was done really, and went around and did win a contest. But it was, it entered, periods of contests, and so it was just a coincidence that they really came out.
Okay, so sometimes just the timing of the publishing industry is.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with when you were done with which.
Right.
But you were working on both at the same time.
But I like the idea of working on this poetry in the fall and the prose in the spring. That sounds
That's
that sounds
my
nice.
ideal,
Yeah.
actually.
Or maybe prose during the day and poetry at night or something. Or
Right.
having some sort of, you have to have some system.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think people often ask me, like, how do you know something's going to be a story or a poem? And I've never written short stories. So I think that's like the difference, it's not as though, it's either going to be like this very involved world that can be, the thing that I enjoy about reading novels is they can be so digressive. You can kind of like waste space. You can, have your character go on a long walk and have like, strange thoughts and make discoveries. And it doesn't have to be as like completely economical as like the modern American choice story that you can see in the New Yorker, where like, every paragraph, every encounter like has to bear on the overall meaning. So yes, I think that's why I'm able to keep them straight in my mind, is that if it is going to be something short, it's definitely going to be a poem.
When you were doing your MFA, you said you were working on both at the same time, but I think you were in a program that requires you to choose a track. Which track?
Yeah, that's poetry.
Poetry.
Yeah.
So you were working on this novel, but you were putting together a poetry thesis for your MFA.
Yep.
That's really interesting.
We met when you were at your MFA.
Mm-hmm.
I believe, yeah.